My name is Clara Whitfield, and I am 30 years old. The first time my mother told me I was the reason bad things happened in our family, I was 9 years old, and standing in the kitchen of our house in Savannah, Georgia, barefoot on the tile floor with a bowl of cereal in my hands. My brother Ryan had broken the sliding glass door with a baseball. He was 11. He had been throwing it against the side of the house even though our father had told him twice to stop. The ball went wide, hit the glass, and the whole door came apart in a sound I can still hear when I close my eyes, that specific almost musical crash of a large pane breaking into 1,000 pieces across a patio. Ryan stood there in the backyard looking at the hole he had made, and my mother came running from the living room, looked at the glass, looked at me standing 15 feet away holding my Cheerios and said, "Clara, what did you do?" It was not a question. There was no upward lift at the end. It was a verdict. And when I pointed at Ryan and said he threw the ball, she looked at me with something I would spend the next 21 years trying to name and said, "You always have to blame someone, don't you? You always have to make yourself the victim." Ryan never said a word. He didn't have to. In our family, the math had been settled long before either of us was old enough to understand it. Ryan was the son they had tried for, the child my mother called her answered prayer at every Thanksgiving table. I was the accident that came first, the daughter who arrived 18 months too early and never stopped being slightly in the way. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I know people hear my parents favored my brother, and they think of small things, birthday presents that were slightly uneven, an extra scoop of ice cream, the front seat of the car. That is not what I am talking about. I am talking about a household where one child was the sun, and the other was something the sun cast a shadow on, and everyone. My parents, my grandparents, the neighbors, even eventually me, just accepted that arrangement like it was weather. Something you couldn't change and shouldn't question. Ryan could fail a class, and my father, Donald Whitfield, would call the teacher to complain about the grading. I could bring home a 92, and my mother would ask what happened to the other 8 points. Ryan wrecked my father's truck when he was 16, drove it into a mailbox at 2 in the morning after drinking at a friend's house, and my parents told the insurance company the truck had been stolen. When I was 17 and came home 14 minutes past curfew because my friend Denise had a flat tire on Route 204, my mother locked the front door and made me sleep on the porch. In October, I could fill this whole story with examples and still not reach the bottom of it, but that is not really the story I came here to tell. The story I came here to tell is about what happened 12 days before my wedding, and the thing my parents did that made everything before it looked like practice. I met Marcus Hale when I was 26. I was teaching 4th grade at a public school in Charleston, South Carolina, which is where I had moved after college specifically because it was far enough from Savannah that my parents' gravity couldn't pull me back into orbit every weekend. Marcus was 31, an architect at a mid-size firm downtown, and we met because his niece was in my class. He came to a parent-teacher conference in place of his sister, who was working a night shift, and I remember he sat in one of those tiny chairs across from my desk, with his knees practically at his chest, and listened to me talk about his niece's reading level like I was delivering the most important information he had ever received. He asked a follow-up question. That was the thing that got me. Not his face, not his shoulders, not the way he filled out that blue button-down. He asked a follow-up question about phonics strategies, wrote down what I said, and thanked me like he meant it. I had spent my entire life around people who either talked over me or waited for me to finish so they could redirect the conversation to themselves. And here was this man, in a child-sized chair, treating my words like they had weight. We started dating 3 weeks later. Coffee first, then dinner, then weekends that stretched longer and longer until we stopped pretending we weren't building something. Marcus was steady in a way I didn't know men could be. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't keep score. When I told him something difficult, he didn't immediately try to fix it or explain it away. He just held it with me until I figured out what I needed. After 15 months, he proposed on a Sunday morning in our kitchen. I was making eggs. He was supposed to be making coffee, but instead, he was standing behind me, and when I turned around, he was holding a ring box, and his eyes were wet, and he said, "Clara, I have never been more sure of anything." And I dropped the spatula on the floor and said yes, and we stood there in our pajamas in the kitchen of our apartment on King Street with egg whites burning on the stove, and I thought, so this is what it feels like when someone picks you on purpose. We set the wedding for a Saturday in early November. Venue was a restored plantation house about 40 minutes outside Charleston. Middleton Place if you know it, though we were using a private event space on the grounds, not the main house. The rehearsal dinner was planned for Friday evening at a restaurant called The Ordinary, a seafood hall in the French Quarter with high ceilings and exposed brick, and the kind of warm low light that makes everyone look like they belong in a painting. I had invited my parents. I want to explain that because I know, reading this now, it seems like an obvious mistake. But you have to understand that I had spent 30 years performing a very specific dance with them. I had learned their rhythms. I knew when to step close and when to pull away. I had gotten good enough at managing the relationship that I had convinced myself it was manageable. They had been reasonably well behaved during the engagement. My mother had even said, once, on the phone, that Marcus seemed like a nice enough man. For her, that was practically a standing ovation. I thought we could get through one weekend, one ceremony, one set of family photos, and then I could go back to the careful distance that kept me sane. 12 days before the wedding, Marcus called me during my lunch break. I was sitting in my classroom eating a turkey sandwich and grading spelling tests, and I picked up the phone and said, "Hey, what's up?" And there was a pause that lasted about 2 seconds too long. He said, "Clara, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you respond." Marcus never talked like that. Marcus was direct. He said what he meant and moved on. So when I heard that measured, cautious tone in his voice, something in my chest tightened before he even said the next sentence. He told me that my parents had driven up from Savannah that morning, 3.5 hours without calling me, without telling me they were coming, and showed up at his office on Broad Street. They had walked into the reception area of his firm, asked for him by name, and sat across from him in a conference room, like they were clients about to commission a building. And then they told him that when I was 23 years old, I had been arrested for stealing $12,000 from the restaurant where I worked. They told him I had a criminal record. They told him I had been fired, charged, and that the only reason I hadn't gone to jail was because the owner had agreed not to press charges after the money was returned. My father, Donald, had leaned forward in his chair and said, "We just thought you should know who you're marrying." My mother, sitting beside him in a restaurant like they were ordering lunch, had added, "She has a way of hiding things, Marcus. We love her, but you deserve the truth." Marcus said he had sat there for a long time after they left. He said he didn't believe them. He said that specifically and clearly. I didn't believe them, Clara, but he also said he needed to hear it from me, and he needed me to understand that whatever the truth was, it would not change anything between us, but that he couldn't carry their words around without giving me a chance to address them. I sat in my classroom with 22 spelling tests on my desk and my turkey sandwich going cold, and I felt something crack open inside me that I had spent 7 years sealing shut. Because here is the truth. When I was 23, I was working as a bookkeeper at a restaurant in Savannah called Porto. It was a mid-range Italian place on Broughton Street, family-owned, popular with the locals. I had taken the job after graduating because teaching positions were hard to find that year, and I needed income while I applied to schools in other cities. The owner, a man named George Callis, was decent to work for. The hours were long, but the work was straightforward. Invoices, payroll, vendor payments, bank deposits. My brother Ryan was 25 at the time and between jobs, which was a permanent state he had perfected into an art form. He was living in my parents' basement, spending money he didn't have, and running up credit card debt that my parents kept quietly paying off like it was a utility bill. Ryan knew I worked at Porto. He knew the systems I used. He knew the deposit schedule, because I had mentioned it once, casually at a family dinner, not realizing I was handing a roadmap to someone who would use it. Over a period of about 6 weeks, Ryan used access he gained during a visit to the restaurant. He had come in one afternoon to have lunch, and I had let him sit in the back office while I finished a task, which is the decision I have replayed more times than I can count, to skim money from the deposit account. He figured out the login credentials because I had them written on a sticky note on my monitor, which I know was careless, but I was 23 and it was a restaurant, not a bank, and I did not imagine that my own brother would steal from my workplace using my name. He took $11,600 over 6 weeks. Small amounts each time, just enough to not trigger an immediate alarm. When George noticed the discrepancy during a quarterly review, everything pointed to me. My credentials, my access, my login history. I was the bookkeeper. There was no other logical suspect. George called me into his office on a Tuesday afternoon and told me what he had found, and I sat across from him and I felt the room tilt sideways because I knew, immediately and with absolute certainty, that Ryan had done this, and I also knew, just as immediately, that proving it would mean going to war with my entire family. I told George I hadn't taken the money. He wanted to believe me. He did believe me, partially. But $11,000 was missing, and my fingerprints were the only ones on the keyboard. He said he was going to file a police report. I called them my parents that night. I told them what had happened. I told them I was sure Ryan had done it. I begged them to talk to him, to make him come forward, to help me fix this before it destroyed my career and my life. My mother said, "Clara, why do you always have to drag your brother into your problems?" My father said, "If you were more careful, this wouldn't have happened. You need to take responsibility." Ryan, when confronted by my parents in the version of the conversation they later described to me, denied everything. And that was the end of the discussion in the Whitfield household. Ryan denied it. Case closed. I was either lying or careless, and either way, it was my fault. Here is what actually happened next. George filed the report. A detective named Paulson came to the restaurant, reviewed the records, and interviewed me. I told him everything. About Ryan, about the office visit, about the sticky note. He was professional and non-committal. He said he would look into it. Weeks went by. The investigation moved slowly. I was suspended from my job. My name was attached to a police report for embezzlement in the city where I had grown up, where my parents went to church, where my old teachers lived, where everyone knew the Whitfield family. And this is the part that still makes my hands shake when I think about it, my father went to George Callis and paid him the full amount. $11,600. He wrote a personal check, and he told George that I had confessed privately to the family, that I was deeply ashamed, and that he was making it right on my behalf. He asked George to drop the matter with the police and to accept the repayment as resolution. George, who was a small business owner dealing with a hole in his books and a drawn-out police investigation, accepted. The detective closed the case. No charges were filed. And in the official, informal record of what happened at Porto restaurant. In the summer I was 23, Clara Whitfield stole money from her employer, and her father cleaned up the mess. My father did not do this to protect me. He did this to protect Ryan. Because if the investigation continued, if Detective Paulson dug deeper, if the IP addresses and timestamps were analyzed more carefully, they would have led to Ryan. And my father knew that. My mother knew that. They both knew exactly who had taken that money, and they chose to let me carry it because that was the role I had been assigned since I was 9 years old. Standing in the kitchen, holding a bowls of cereal while a broken door glittered on the patio behind me. I never fought it publicly. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I didn't go back to Detective Paulson and demand the case be reopened. I didn't hire a lawyer. I didn't stand on the courthouse steps and declare my innocence. I was 23 years old and exhausted and ashamed, and so deeply conditioned to absorb blame for things I did not do, that fighting felt like trying to swim in concrete. Instead, I left. I packed my car, drove to Charleston, got a teaching certification, and built a life 4 hours away from the people who had let me burn so their golden child could stay warm. I told Marcus all of this on the phone that afternoon, every detail, the sticky note, the check, the detective, Ryan. I told him about the years of therapy it had taken to stop waking up in the middle of the night, convinced I was going to be arrested for something I didn't do. I told him I had not told him before because the shame of it, even the wrongful shame, had become so fused to my bones that speaking it out loud felt like peeling skin. Marcus listened to all of it. When I was done, he was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then he said, "I'm going to ask you one question, and then I'm done asking." I said, "Okay." He said, "Did you take that money?" I said, "No." He said, "Then we're getting married in 12 days and your parents can go to hell." That was the man I was marrying. But Marcus's belief in me, as complete and unshakable as it was, did not undo what my parents had planted. They had calculated the timing, 12 days before a wedding. Close enough that doubt could settle into the cracks of even the strongest foundation. Close enough that Marcus's family, his mother, Janet, his sister, Leah, his aunts and uncles and cousins, who had welcomed me with the kind of easy warmth I had never experienced from my own people, might hear a rumor, might wonder, might look at me differently across the rehearsal dinner table, and see someone whose past didn't quite add up. My parents had been doing this my entire life. Not with fists, not with anything that leaves a visible mark. With stories, with versions. With carefully placed words that rearranged reality just enough to keep me off balance and keep themselves looking reasonable. They were artists of it, and 12 days before my wedding, they painted their masterpiece. What they did not know was who was already on her way to Charleston, and what she was carrying in a brown leather bag on the passenger seat of her car. The rehearsal dinner was on a Friday evening. The ordinary was everything I had imagined. Raw bar gleaming under pendant lights, long communal tables set with white linen and small glass votives, the hum of conversation bouncing off those beautiful high ceilings. Our closest people were gathered. Marcus's mother, Janet, was at the far end of the table telling a story that had his sister laughing so hard she had to put down her wine glass. Marcus's college roommate, Derek, was at the bar arguing about football with Marcus's uncle. The room smelled like bread and oysters and candle wax, and for a moment, standing in the doorway in my green dress with my hair pinned up, I felt like I was looking at a photograph of someone else's happiness and wondering how I had wandered into the frame. My parents were there. Second table from the wall. My father was wearing the navy blazer he wore to every occasion that required one, and my mother was in a cream-colored dress that she had probably selected to photograph well. They had arrived 20 minutes early, which was unusual for them, and which I now understand was strategic. They wanted to be settled, composed, positioned before the room filled up. They wanted to look like they belonged there more than I did. I had not spoken to them since Marcus's phone call. They had texted twice. My mother's text said, "We hope we can put the unpleasantness behind us and enjoy this weekend as a family." My father said, "See you Friday." I had not responded to either. I had not uninvited them because some part of me, the part that had spent 30 years trying to earn a love that was never actually available, could not bring myself to say the words. And because another part of me, the part that was tired in a way that sleep could not fix, had simply decided to get through the weekend and deal with the rest later. Dinner was scheduled to start at 7. At 7:42, the hostess came to our private dining area and told me there was someone at the front asking for me. I thought it was a late guest, maybe Marcus's cousin who was driving down from Columbia. I excused myself and walked through the main dining room to the entrance. Standing at the host stand was a woman named Pauline Vickers. I had not seen Pauline in almost 6 years. She had been the front-of-house manager at Porto restaurant during the time I worked there. She was 51 now, a little grayer, a little thinner, but with the same sharp, watchful eyes that had always made me feel like she was cataloging the room at all times. We had not been close, exactly, but she had been kind to me during the weeks when everything fell apart. She was one of the few people at Porto who had said, quietly and without making a scene, that she didn't think I had stolen that money. She said it to me once in the walk-in cooler while I was trying not to cry, and I had never forgotten it. I did not know why she was standing in a restaurant in Charleston on a Friday evening. I had not invited her. I did not even know she knew I was getting married. She said my name and then she said, "I'm sorry to just show up like this. I know this is your night. But I drove 3 hours and I need 10 minutes, and it cannot wait until after this weekend." We stepped outside onto the sidewalk. It was November in Charleston, cool but not cold, and the street was quiet except for the occasional car passing on Meeting Street. Pauline was holding a tote bag, and from it she pulled a thick manila folder and a smaller envelope. She told me to open the folder first. Inside were bank records, specifically login records from Porto's accounting system. The one Sonai had used, the one Ryan had accessed, showing IP addresses and device identifiers for every login session during the 6-week period when the money was taken. Pauline explained that George Callis had sold the restaurant 2 years ago, and that the new owners had done a full technology audit during the transition. The old server had been imaged as part of the handover, and the IT company hired for the audit had generated detailed access logs that George's original, much simpler system had never captured. The logs showed that during the period in question, there were 2 distinct devices accessing the bookkeeping system. One was the desktop computer at the restaurant, which was mine. The other was a laptop that connected remotely from an IP address, registered to a residential location in Savannah. My parents' house, where Ryan was living. 7 of the 11 transactions that moved money out of the deposit account were initiated from that laptop. Not my computer, not my credentials, technically. Ryan had used a session token that remained active from the time I let him sit in the office, which the system had never timed out because no one had configured it to. The digital trail was as clear as a signature. Ryan Whitfield had logged in from Donald and Patricia Whitfield's home address and transferred money out of Porto's account 7 separate times. I stood on that sidewalk and I looked at those records and I felt something move through me that was so large and so old I couldn't name it. It was not surprise, I had always known. But there is a difference between knowing something in the way you know your own heartbeat. Constant, internal, unprovable to anyone who isn't you. And holding the proof of it in your hands on a piece of paper with timestamps and addresses and the cold, indifferent precision of a machine that cannot be guilted or gaslit into changing its story. Then Pauline told me to open the envelope. Inside were printed screenshots of a text message exchange between my mother, Patricia Whitfield, and George Callis. The messages were from 4 months ago. My mother had reached out to George directly. She told him she had heard through mutual acquaintances that I was engaged, and she wanted to make sure he understood that the situation at the restaurant had been fully resolved, and that he should not feel obligated to share any details with anyone. George had responded politely. And then my mother had sent a follow-up message that I read 3 times on that sidewalk because I needed to make sure I was seeing the words correctly. She wrote, "George, I want to be straightforward with you. If anyone contacts you about Clara's time at Porto, we would appreciate it if you confirmed that Clara was responsible for the missing funds and that Dawn made restitution on her behalf. I know this is a sensitive request, but it is important for our family's privacy that the story remains consistent." She was not just letting me carry the blame. She was actively maintaining it, polishing it, making sure the frame she had built around me 7 years ago was still hanging straight on the wall. George had not responded to that message. He had, however, forwarded the entire exchange to Pauline, who he had stayed in touch with over the years. He sent it with a single line, "I thought you should see this. I don't feel right about it." Pauline had sat on it for 3 months, debating what to do. Then she heard through the same small-town network that keeps Savannah connected like a circuit board that I was getting married in Charleston on Saturday, and she got in her car and drove. I asked her why. Why drive 3 hours for someone she hadn't spoken to in 6 years? Why risk ruining a stranger's rehearsal dinner? She said, "Because I watched you walk out of that restaurant carrying something that wasn't yours to carry, and I didn't do enough about it at the time, and I have thought about that more often than you would believe." I stood there for a long moment. The sounds of the restaurant were muffled behind the closed door. I could hear, faintly, laughter from inside. Marcus's family, my friends, the people who had come to celebrate something real. And out here on the sidewalk, I was holding the receipts for every lie my parents had ever told about me. And for the first time in my life, the proof was not locked inside my own memory where they could rearrange it. It was printed, time-stamped, external, undeniable. I went back inside. Marcus saw my face from across the room and was at my side in 4 steps. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just put his hand on my back and stood next to me and waited for me to tell him what I needed. I said, "I need 2 minutes, and then I need you to not stop me." He nodded. I walked to my parents' table. My mother was cutting a piece of bread. My father was drinking red wine. They looked up at me with the same pleasant, neutral expressions they had been wearing all evening. The faces they put on in public. The ones that said, "We are normal, we are loving, there is nothing to see here." I set the folder on the table between their plates. I did not throw it. I did not slam it. I placed it down carefully, the way you set down something that has taken you a very long time to find. I said, "These are the server logs from Porto restaurant, showing that Ryan accessed the accounting system from your house 7 times and transferred the money that I was blamed for. And these are text messages between Mom and George Callis from 4 months ago, where Mom asked him to keep confirming that I was the one who stole it." My mother's hand stopped moving on the bread knife. My father set down his wine glass with a small, precise movement that told me he was working very hard to control something. I was not loud. I did not need to be. The tables were close enough together that everyone in our private dining area could hear me speaking at a normal volume, and I spoke at a normal volume because I had spent 30 years shouting into rooms where no one was listening, and I had finally learned that the quietest voice in the room is sometimes the one that carries furthest. I said, "You told Marcus I was a criminal. You drove 3 hours to sit in his office and lie about your own daughter 12 days before her wedding. And the reason you did it is the same reason you've done everything else, because protecting Ryan and controlling me is more important to you than the truth has ever been." My father opened his mouth. I don't know what he was going to say because I didn't let him say it. I was not interested in another version. I was not interested in another rearrangement of facts delivered in his reasonable, measured tone that made everything he said sound like common sense, even when it was cruelty. I said, "I need you to leave." My mother looked at the tablecloth. It was a gesture I had seen 1,000 times. The downward glance, the slight tightening of the lips, the performed sadness of a woman who had perfected the art of looking wounded while holding the knife. But this time, for the first time, every person in that room had seen the knife too. My father stood up. He buttoned his blazer. He did not apologize. He did not deny it. He took my mother's arm, and they walked out of the private dining room, and through the main restaurant, and out the front door of the ordinary. And I watched them go, and I felt something release in my chest that had been clenched so tight for so long I had forgotten it was there. The room was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that happens when a group of people collectively realizes that the thing they just witnessed was real and significant, and not something that can be smoothed over with a joke or a change of subject. Then Marcus's mother, Janet, who was 63 years old and had been a social worker for 31 years and had a bullshit detector that could pick up signals from 3 counties away, stood up from her chair and walked over to me and took my face in both her hands and said, "That's my daughter-in-law." And she pulled me into a hug that smelled like her perfume and felt like arriving somewhere I had been trying to get to my whole life. And then Leah started clapping, and then Derek, and then the whole table, and I stood there in the warm light of that beautiful restaurant with Marcus's arm around my waist, and Pauline watching from the doorway, with tears running down her face. And I let the sound fill every empty room I had ever stood in, wondering why no one believed me. We got married the next day, Saturday, November 9th. The weather was cool and clear, and the ceremony was outside under a canopy of live oaks draped with Spanish moss, and if that sounds like a postcard, I promise you it felt like one too. Marcus cried during his vows. I held it together during mine until the very last line, and then I didn't, and that was fine. Pauline was in the 3rd row. I had asked her that morning if she would come, and she had said yes without hesitating, like she had been waiting to be asked. My parents were not there. My brother was not there. I want to tell you that it didn't hurt, but I am trying to tell the truth in this story, and the truth is that it did. There is a specific kind of grief that comes from looking at the seats where your parents should be sitting on your wedding day and seeing them empty, and knowing that the emptiness is not because they couldn't come, but because they chose, again and again and again over the course of your entire life, to be the kind of people who could not be trusted to sit in those chairs without turning them into weapons. But here is the other truth, the one that matters more. Those empty chairs were not a tragedy. They were a boundary, and I had finally stopped apologizing for having one. 3 weeks after the wedding, I filed a formal request with the Charleston County Sheriff's Office to have Detective Paulson's original case file updated with the server log evidence. I do not know if anything will come of it. The case was closed years ago. Statutes of limitation are complicated. I did not do it because I expect Ryan to be arrested, or my father to face consequences for paying off George Callis. I did it because somewhere in a filing cabinet in Savannah, there is a folder with my name on it and a version of events that is not true, and I have decided that I am done carrying other people's wreckage in my name. My name is Clara Whitfield. Or Clara Hale now, technically, though I'm still getting used to writing it. I am 30 years old. I spent most of those years believing that the people who were supposed to protect me had simply gotten a defective version of a daughter and were doing their best with what they had. I know now that I was never defective. I was just inconvenient. I was the child who saw clearly in a family that required fog, and they punished me for it every day of my life until I walked far enough away that they had to drive 3.5 hours to reach me with their damage. If this story found you, if you are sitting somewhere right now carrying something that was never yours to carry, a lie, a label, a version of yourself that someone else wrote because it was easier than looking at what they had done, I want you to tell you that the proof is not always going to show up at your rehearsal dinner in a manila folder. Sometimes it doesn't come at all. Sometimes you have to be your own evidence. But either way, the story they told about you is not the story that ends you. Sometimes it is exactly where your real one begins. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel. Every story we tell here is for someone who needed to hear it today. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and come back for the next one. Because the best chapters are always still ahead.